If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. I have to give you a content warning for this episode. In this episode, there is graphic violence. There's actually a lot of graphic violence. Usually, I give you timestamps in the episode description for the episode for the content warnings, so in case you want to skip over certain parts. But for this episode, there would be a lot of timestamps. So I'm just going to give you a heads up that in this episode, there is some gruesome violence. Alright, now let's get started. I have asked you, dear listener, a few times this season to forget what you know about pirates so I could not shatter what you think of them, but at the very least, put a little crack in the foundation. Going into this season, I wanted you to see the subjects of this season not as pirates, but as people. That is actually how I have tried to approach every person I have covered on this podcast. I always want the subject to be more than whatever the theme is the season I cover them in. At the beginning of this season, I wanted you to see these pirates as people that existed outside of their pirate persona. To show you that stereotypes never speak for a group as a whole, even when that group is pirates. I will admit that some subjects have made my task a little more harder than others, and it almost seems like the subject of this week's episode made it his life's mission to make it impossible. This pirate fell into all of the pirate stereotypes, and the deeds that he did could haunt anyone's nightmares. Ahoy! My name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 11th episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. 'Tis season 3 o' History Shelf, and I have titled this season, Yo Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me. In this season be all about pirates, the pirates and scallywags that sailed the 7 seas, and some rivers, looking for booty as they made their travels. Some of these pirates came from humble beginnings, while others surprisingly came from well-to-do families. But no matter where or who they came from, they all had one thing in common. They would be pirates. And for this week, I am talking about Edward Low. Edward Low was better known as Ned. Edward was an Englishman. He was from Westminster, London, to be more exact. And he was born around the year 1690. If you take a look at Edward's life, then you will find that the odds of Edward living an honest life were against him. He was born into a family that lived outside of the law. Stealing was not an uncommon hobby for the Low family. Edward's younger brother Richard would get into a basket on the back of a friend, and he would steal hats and wigs from passers-by. Eventually, this life of petty crime would lead Richard to burglary, and in 1707 he would be hanged for it. Edward himself engaged in pickpocketing and gambling as a young child. This life of crime wasn't for adventure or excitement, it was for survival. Edward's family was poor. Edward would eventually advance to bigger crimes. He started to also burglarize homes. It wasn't long before Edward had the law after him. Edward decided to leave the life of crime on the London streets behind him around 1710, and he traveled to the New World for a new start. He bounced around from town to town before he finally settled in Boston, Massachusetts. There in Boston, a woman named Eliza Marble captivated Edward's heart, and on August 12, 1714, they were married at the First Church of Boston. Edward had really turned his life around in Boston. No longer was he relying on crime to put food on the table. Together, Edward and Eliza had a son, but sadly their son died when he was only an infant. In the winter of 1719, Eliza gave birth to their daughter Elizabeth. The childbirth was too much for Eliza, and she passed away due to childbirth complications, leaving Edward all alone to raise their daughter. Edward loved his wife deeply, and her death really impacted his behavior. He was devastated by his wife's passing. It would be sweet if his change hadn't been so sadistic. Edward was cocky and quick to anger, and when you mix that combination with grief, it can cause a storm. It wasn't long after his wife died that he was fired. Edward then decided to leave Boston. Edward left his daughter in Boston, and although he would later express regret for abandoning his daughter, he would never see her again. When Edward left Boston, he did not immediately turn to piracy. At first, he worked on a ship as a rigger. That sloop was headed for Honduras. Edward was in command of the crew that went ashore to get logwood and bring it back to the ship. In December of 1721, him and his crew returned one day to the ship, and they were hungry. They wanted to eat dinner before they finished loading the ship, but the ship's captain told them no. This did not go over well with the quick-to-anger Edward. Edward grabbed his pistol to shoot the captain, but he missed, and instead his bullet hit a sailor that was standing behind the captain. Edward thought fast, and he hopped in the boat with his 12 crewmen and headed for the ship. Edward and the 12 other men took off with the ship. Edward was now a pirate. It doesn't appear that Edward's decision to become a pirate was thoroughly thought out before he became one, but when he did become one, he quickly became committed to the role. Him and his crew of 12 took a small sloop shortly after they took off. After they had their second vessel in Rhode Island, the crew voted Edward as their captain, and then they sailed to the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands was where Edward met fellow pirate Captain George Lowther. George was in need of some men, so he ran a deal by Edward. He proposed that the two groups become one, and Edward would become his lieutenant. Edward, along with his crew, agreed to join George. So Edward and his crew sunk the small vessel that they had captured, and they joined George. January 10, 1722 was the day the pair came across their first victim. It was Captain Benjamin Edwards, who was the captain of the Greyhound of Boston. They found the ship in the Bay of Honduras. There they attacked the ship. They forced the crewmen Christopher Atwell, Charles Harris, Henry Smith, Joseph Willis, and David Lindsay to join their crew. but not before they whipped and beat them. The beating of the crew would not be something out of the ordinary in the story of Edward Low. In fact, Edward was known for his cruelty. Edward enjoyed torturing captives, even the ones that surrendered peacefully. He would torture them to find the locations of valuables, or sometimes he would torture people just for his own enjoyment. Like I said earlier, something changed in Edward when his wife died. Or maybe the monster had been hidden inside of him all along, and his wife was the only thing that kept it from breaking free. Written in a general history of pirates are the details of Edward's monstrous deeds. We are not sure how reliable that source is, so it's a possibility that some details may have been exaggerated. But we do have other contemporary sources that describe his sadistic nature. In 1722, Edward captured the Wright Galley in the Azores. The crew had defended themselves against the attack that Edward and his crew unleashed on them. Edward responded by having his crew cut and mangle them. On another occasion, Edward had taken a French ship. He let everyone on the ship go, but the ship's cook. He said that the cook was greasy and he would fry up well. The cook was bound to the mainmast alive, and the ship was burned. Edward also liked to place burning matches between the fingers of his prisoners, make non-lethal cuts, and he also liked to flog his prisoners vigorously. He was known for cutting off lips and ears and ripping out beating hearts, and then making other prisoners eat the body parts that he had taken from his victims. Edward and George spent the summer of 1722 raiding ships. They were quite the successful duo. Not everyone that they fought, though, gave up and accepted their fate. In the Bay of Amantique in Belize, a village actually fought back and they managed to burn one of their ships. In early May of 1722, Edward and George sailed to the West Indies and they plundered and sank a ship there. On May 28, 1722, they were in Charlestown, Massachusetts. There, they captured a brigantine named the Rebecca. The Rebecca was captained by James Flecker and had 23 people on board, including 5 women. Women were never the subject of Edward's cruelty. He always made sure that the women made it safely to port. Maybe it was because he saw his beloved wife in their eyes, or maybe they reminded him of his daughter that he left back in Boston. Edward also refused to press gang any married men. Edward and George's partnership didn't last forever, though. Before the calendar said 1723, Edward and George had went their separate ways. George didn't like how unruly Edward was, so George gave Edward the Rebecca and a crew of 40 men, and he parted ways with him. Edward liked finding easy targets off the coast of North America. He liked small and poorly armed merchant ships. In August of 1722, he captured and robbed 2 sloops off the coast of Rhode Island. He let those ships go, but he did cut their rigging and he threw it overboard so they couldn't alert anyone before he had a chance to sail far enough away. He captured 13 fishing ships off the coast of Nova Scotia. One of the large vessels became his new flagship, named the Fancy. In his pirate career, he would actually have 2 ships named the Fancy. Other ships were the Rose Pink, the Ranger, the Squirrel, the Fortune, and the Merry Christmas. The Rose Pink ended up capsizing due to Edward's inexperience. Edward had ordered his men to remove the seaweed and barnacles from the bottom of the boats. Edward ordered too many men to the outside of the boat, and the Rose Pink tipped too far. The portholes were left open, and so the ship sank. Most of their provisions were lost, and they had to ration their fresh water to half a pint per man per day. Edward made his way to Granada. Shout out to all my listeners in Granada. He hid most of his men below deck, and he was permitted to send men ashore for water. A French sloop went to investigate Edward's ship the next day, and when they did, Edward's men came out of hiding. He took the sloop and he renamed it the Ranger. He gave the ship that he had been commanding, the Squirrel, to his quartermaster, Francis Spriggs. Francis would rename the ship the Delight, and he would eventually end up sailing away with it in the middle of the night after he had a disagreement with Edward over the disciplining of one of Francis's crewmen. During his career, Edward captured many vessels. He captured the Fortune, that was captained by John Welland. After Edward stripped the ship, he beat John and then he cut off his ear. On January 25th, 1723, Edward captured the Portuguese vessel the Victoria. The captain of the ship dropped 15,000 pounds worth of gold into the sea because he didn't want Edward to have it. Edward's response was to cut the captain's lips off, broil them, and then force the captain to eat his own lips while they were still hot. Then Edward murdered the remaining crew. Even Edward's own men saw him as a brute. In the spring of 1723, Edward was once again in Honduras. That was when he came across a Spanish vessel that had captured Englishmen. Edward and his crew managed to kill over 60 of the Spaniards before sailing back to the Caribbean. I was unable to find a description of Edward's appearance, but I did find something that said that one of his crew members had accidentally cut his mouth during a failed torture incident, and botched surgery had left Edward scarred. Edward's first pirate flag he used was a black flag with a white skeleton. In one hand, the skeleton held an hourglass, and the other it held a spear aiming towards a red heart with 3 drops of blood coming from the heart. This was the same flag that Francis Spriggs used. The next flag that he used had a black background with a red skeleton. This became Edward's most famous flag. He also used a green silk flag with a yellow figure of a man blowing a trumpet. It was known as the Green Trumpeter. Edward got bolder as his pirate career went along. On June 10, 1723, he attacked a British Navy ship around Long Island. It was the HMS Greyhound. He attacked the ship with his ships the Fortune and the Ranger. This fight would last 8 long hours, and it wouldn't go in Edward's favor. Edward was forced to flee. Charles Harris had command of the other ship, and he did not make it out so lucky. Charles was caught and then hanged in Newport, Rhode Island in July of 1723. Edward went on plundering, torturing, and killing. In Nantucket, he attacked a whaling ship. He flogged and cut off the ears of the captain before he shot him dead. When he ran into another whaling ship in Rhode Island, he gave him the same treatment, except he made the captain eat his own ears before shooting him dead. The second captain on that ship had his beating heart cut out of his chest, and then Edward forced another prisoner to eat the heart. Edward's horrifying deeds had reached the newspapers. Authorities knew that they had to get Edward out of the waters. Edward headed north and he took 23 French fishing ships off Cape Breton. He then took a 22 cannon ship and he followed that up with taking a 34-gun ship in August of 1723. In September of 1723, he was back in Azores. As Edward's fleet sailed along the coast of West Africa, Edward had no idea that his reign of terror was nearing an end. Edward did not go out in a blaze of glory after having a long and arduous battle. Instead, he went out by his own crew. I covered Edward's barbaric nature he showed his captives. Well, he started to turn that barbaric nature on his own crew. In early of 1724, Edward's crew didn't want to become another victim of their unhinged captain, so they marooned him on a deserted island. What happened next isn't known for sure, but there is one French account that says that he was captured by a French ship and he was hanged in Martinique. This is Edward's legacy. Edward is mentioned in Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. He's also mentioned in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Green Flag. Edward was put on a postage stamp by the Cayman Islands in 1975. In 1994, Antigua and Barbuda featured Edward and the Rebecca on a $100 bill made of gold leaf. Edward is one of the featured pirates on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland. A duplicate of his pirate flag was used by the character Sao Fung in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. They used the pirate flag that has the black background and a red skeleton on it. Edward was a character in the TV series Black Sails, and today many treasure hunters roam the waters that Edward once sailed in hopes that they find treasure from one of the ships that he sunk. Pirates like Edward Low were the reason why we had the Golden Age of Piracy, but they were also the reason why it ended. Their dangerous actions increased the military presence in the seas, thus causing the death of the very thing that they gave birth to. And that was the life of Edward Low. Thank you so much for listening to the 11th episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Anne Bonny. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. The Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. And the Snapchat is History_Shelf. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a thank you to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links and you buy something, that would help support the podcast. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help out the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode.